Good afternoon, Mr. Nigel Brooksby, Chairman of UK Life Sciences Board, Board Member of the Cogent Sector Skills Council, or SSC, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Distinguished Speakers Series organized by the Institute of Innovation and Entrepreneurship of SMU. Every year, IIE invites global exemplars in innovation and entrepreneurship to share their experiences with the SMU community and the public. This November, we are very honored to have Mr. Nigel Brooksby with us today. Mr. Nigel Brooksby is the Chairman of the UK Life Sciences Board and Board Member of Cogent Sector Skills Council. Cogent is the UK's industry skills body for pharmaceutical, nuclear, petroleum, polymers and life sciences businesses. During his 38-year career in the pharmaceutical industry, Mr. Brooksby achieved a meteoric rise from medical sales representative to industry leader. He made significant contributions to the companies he has worked for, the industries he works in, and the charities he has supported. Previously, he held senior global appointments in Wellcome, now known as GSK, as well as Pfizer. Until his recent retirement, he was also chairman and managing director of Sanofi UK. He has worked internationally based in Europe, the USA, Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa. Mr. Brooksby is a past president of the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Association, or ABPI, and was honored as a lifetime member in recognition of his services to the life sciences and his term of office as president. He is chairman of the Pharmaceutical Directors Club, a fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine and the Royal Society of Arts, and a friend of the Royal College of Physicians. Nigel, Mr. Brooksby is a member of the UK Governmental's Industrial Advisory Board, which advises the Secretary of State for Business and his ministers on applications for investments. He also holds several academic, charity, and life science chairmanships and board positions, which include sitting on the advisory board of Imperial College London and advising the Wellcome Trust and Doctors Net UK, which was recently acquired by M3 USA. Today, Mr. Brooksby will present his views and observations as a global industry attempts to transform itself with the opportunities presented by emerging markets and new technologies to develop new medicines. Without further ado, let us welcome Mr. Nigel Brooksby.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for taking the time to come and hear my short presentation. From the introduction, I think you perhaps know more about me than my own mother does now. So thank you very much for that very warm introduction. The title of the presentation this afternoon is the pharmaceutical industry or life sciences industry. And I don't restrict this just to the traditional drug or pharmaceutical industry. Past, present and future. Being someone who is now 63 years of old, I can talk a lot about the past. I can talk about the present, clearly, and then I'll do a bit of gazing into the crystal ball to see what I think the future holds for life sciences. Thankfully, I'm not going to talk for all of this time. I'm told very reliably, but you're an audience that likes to ask questions of your speakers, so we'll leave sufficient time to ask any questions, and I look forward to spending the next hour or so with you. I mean, needless to say that the industry has changed dramatically over the 40 years that I've been involved, and I think particularly so over the last 2 decades. We're not going to go back 40 years, so don't look too disappointed or excited. And I think the pace of change, the industry, I think for a long time, when I first joined the industry in '73, was relatively easy to predict, was very successful, and was pretty static, really, in terms of change. It wasn't really a change industry. We had a model that worked, that seemed to produce blockbusters at a regular pace, and the way we sold the products was actually fairly simple. We had an army of representatives around the world. We launched the products, we promoted the products, and we almost exclusively promoted them to prescribers, to doctors. All of that is changing, as you'll hear during my presentation. And I think this pace of change is accelerating. So I think for the industry, standing still is not an option. The industry need to embrace those changes and develop strategies and plans that embrace the change and take advantage of the future environment. So really the presentation will say, we'll try and predict towards the end what are the secrets for future success. We know what's brought success in the past. I will get out the crystal ball, not literally, but I will look into it and try and predict the future. Who will be the winners, and importantly, who will be the losers. So it's split into three parts. The past, which I've labelled a decade of doubt. Today, and I think if you're looking to most pharmaceutical companies, everyone's talking about transition or transformation. These seem to be the buzzwords. Where do these buzzwords come from? Well, I think they come from the McKinseys, the KPMGs, the Ernst & Young and Accentures. But if you look into most annual reports, most chief executive and chairman are talking about this period of transformation and transition. And then last but by no means least, I will try and have a step into the future. So if we move over the last 25 years, this industry has been very successful. And at first glance, it seems to be a major success story. And it did. If you think about the medicines that were discovered over the last 25 years, they've been very successful. They've faced up to disease where, quite simply, there wasn't a solution. There was a high degree of unmet need. And in doing so, the pharma industry has created in excess of 1 trillion. I can't imagine trillions. I find it difficult with billions, but trillions I find even more difficult. Has created in excess of $1 trillion globally of shareholder value. So that sounds pretty successful to me. But over the last 10 or 12 years, we've seen a crisis, a collapse in the pharmaceutical industry's R&D capacity, and particularly in R&D productivity. And I think that's led to a loss of faith from shareholders and indeed stakeholders in the potential of this model. Can the industry still innovate? Has the pharmaceutical and life sciences industry lost the ability to innovate? And I put the sword up there because I think the industry right now is a little bit like the sword of Damocles. Damocles, as I think many of you would know, was a courtier. He was around even before me. He was a courtier to the king in the 4th century BC. And he used to flatter the kings, as courtiers did, by saying what a marvellous life the king had. And one day the king said, why don't we swap places? Why don't you come and sit on my throne? So Damocles sat on the throne, sat there very comfortably, feeling like a king, and he looked up, and there was a large sword right over him, held just by one single strand of a hair from a horse's tail. And then he started to think, well, maybe this wasn't such a great job. He actually realised that the responsibility of leadership was not without potential problems. And I think really that describes... Hold on, I think I've gone the wrong way. Hold on. And I think that perhaps describes the industry. The industry is facing this sword of Damocles. And perhaps the end of what were the good old days. The industry I joined, I guess that was the good old days industry, as I described earlier. But over the last 10 or 12 years, there's been a failure to meet shareholders' expectations. There's been a failure to deliver innovation. And at the same time, there's been a collapse in terms of lack of R&D innovation, but also we've seen many, many drugs come off patent. From that wonderful era of blockbusters, drugs like Feldene, that was when I was with Pfizer, and then Lipitor, also with Pfizer, and then when I was with Sanofi, it was Plavix, clopidogrel. These drugs rapidly reached sales of 1 billion, i.e. blockbuster status, and then went on to achieve in a year peak sales of 5 billion plus. And almost at the same time, within a 2 to 3 year period, they lost their patent. And we know once you lose patent in the world of pharmaceuticals, imitations, generics come in, and you lose all the value very, very quickly. It used to take a while, but now within 3 months you've perhaps lost 50% of the value. 12 to 15 months you've perhaps lost all of the value. So suddenly you face a gap. In Pfizer's pipeline it was many billions of dollars when their products came off patent. But it wasn't just Pfizer, it was AstraZeneca, it was Merck, it was Sanofi, it was GSK. It was all of the major drugs. And this has led to a situation where the industry has to regain customers' and shareholders' trust by delivering life-changing new medicines. I think it's still achievable, but it's different and it's more difficult than in the past. And it requires a new model, new disciplines, and the new model and the new disciplines are perhaps there in equal measures. So it requires both a new model, which most of the pharmaceutical industry is trying to implement, but it also requires that magic ingredient, which is called luck. This was the end result. In that decade of doubt, which is still around, the sword of Damocles was hovering. $550 billion of value were destroyed. And it wasn't destroyed because we stopped spending on R&D. In actual fact, you'll see from the statistics there was a 60% increase in R&D spend. And most companies were spending at least 10%, and some were spending 20% of global sales on R&D. So they were spending more and delivering less. And when you look at that percentage of sales that were spent on R&D, you can see it's even higher as an absolute spend, because global sales grew from $200 billion in 1996 to $800 billion in 2009. So a fourfold increase in sales. So the R&D spend increased dramatically. These are the statistics. And again, more statistics in R&D, because this is the root cause of what the industry is having to face up right now. The economic return on R&D has dropped from between 13 and 15% in the 90s to, say, an average of 6% in the last decade. And I'll show you a chart that plots this out in the next few slides. And cumulative success rates have fallen by around 50% as the number of drug development projects and cost per project have doubled. So R&Ds have halved over the last 10 years, and the R&D productivity, the industry success rate in bringing a new drug from research to market, was just 4% in the last decade. Spending more, taking longer, gone up from 10 to 15 years maybe. It's now costing at least $3 billion to bring a drug to the market, and achieving less. So if you had that as your scorecard, as your grade card at college or university, you wouldn't want to take it home to your parents, I don't think. So this shows, and there's one of these in the pack, this shows the economic return on R&D investment. You can see that in the 91 to 1995, very high. And we're only spending around 9 or 10% of sales in R&D. So spending a lot less than we've been spending recently, but achieving a great deal more. This started to decline, 96 to 2000, 13 to 14%, even though the spend was going up. In the early parts of the 2000s, at the turn of the decade, dropped even further to 8 or 9%, and now we're spending 16%. More recently, as I said earlier, it's dropped to 4%, and we're spending 17%. So you think, what's going to happen in the future? Well, on the current trajectory, it's perhaps going to increase slightly to 6% as the spend stays at 15 or 16%. But you'll see later on when I come to my predictions for the future, this fixed rate of spend is not something I would advise. There is not a simple formula for R&D. In some cases, when you've got a really remarkable compound, you need to accelerate it through the development process. You perhaps need to spend 25, I don't know, 25, 30%. But before you reach that stage, you need to weed out the weak candidates in the pipeline, and there's not been enough weeding. Far too many projects have come from phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, and then failed, either commercially or they've hit a roadblock before they got to the market. So the future's either looking like more of the same, or if there can be a step change, if there can be a step change, which I think has to be if we're going to satisfy shareholders and we're going to satisfy that unmet need with modern medicine, maybe we get towards something that we've enjoyed in the past. Not only are we spending more and achieving less, but also the average time a medicine is the only drug available in its therapeutic class has declined dramatically. When I joined... Oops, I keep doing this. You did warn me. When I joined the industry in 1972-73 as a medical representative in the UK, I was with Wellcome, now Glaxo, GSK. We launched 3 new products. We didn't see a competitor for 10 years in those therapeutic classes. One was a novel antibiotic, cotrimoxazole, Septrin. One was allopurinol, which is still the standard therapy for gout. Now, when you launch a product, you sometimes, even that same day, a competitor in the same therapeutic class is launched. So that race to approval has shortened, and we're all getting onto the start line of the grid, to use the Formula 1 analogy, more or less at the same time. So I guess it's not surprising during this decade of doubt, which might not have finished, by the way, that shareholders are losing their patience. The industry is losing some of its glitter. It's no longer the star, the golden boy or golden girl that it was a decade ago. I think if you look around the industry with most of Big Pharma, they've all changed their chief executive, usually for somebody younger, not always from marketing. And in one case, Pfizer, they tried a chief executive from a completely different industry. It didn't work. Not to say it won't work in the future, but it didn't work in this case. So boards have changed, chief executives have changed, virtually every R&D director in the industry has changed. And there is considerable pressure for a more effective, efficient R&D spend. Not necessarily spending less, but achieving more, either with the same amount of money or with less amounts of money. So a lot of change in an industry which is usually very conservative and resistant to change. So so there will be winners and there will be losers. So over the last decade, we've seen mergers, and they've not really been mergers, they've been acquisitions. If you look at them, they've been badged as a merger at the offset. A merger of equals is a term that's very often used, and shareholders are impatient with that. So they want to see the assets required, they want to see rapid integration, and they want to see the synergies squeezed out as quickly as possible. That's what the shareholders are demanding. So some companies have been acquired and assimilated into a new co. Some have beat the odds. Now, some companies, not to say that every company is bad at R&D, but some companies have managed to deliver innovative new medicines over this last decade. The only problem we've got with that, and to be honest, they've got with themselves, is they don't know how they achieved it. They don't know how they achieved their level of innovation. Was it because we had a brilliant scientist? Was it because they joint ventured with a very successful biotech company? Was it because they got integrated in some academic unit? And there are a whole variety of reasons, but there is no one recipe for success over the last decade, which is confusing, because if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, and if you don't understand why it happened, it's difficult to continue doing it in the future. And there's no evidence, and I'm not a pessimistic, my glass is always, hopefully, half full. There's no evidence that the R&D success rates have bottomed out. On that chart, I showed them going back up, but certain industry pundits and analysts think they could continue to descend. They may get worse, hopefully, before they get better. Some companies have beaten the odds, so these are companies, these are top 20 companies, Clearly, I've not identified them. I'd perhaps get sued if I did, and I don't want to get sued, or the university to get sued. And, of course, I don't know, because I think it's from KPMG. No, it's McKinsey data. I have to be sure that I credit McKinsey with it. So you'll see in 1985... Oops, I keep doing it. So you'll see 1985 to 2010, most companies, apart from two, actually outperformed the market. In the first 10 years of 2010, only 3 companies outperformed the market. I think this one's pretty easy to work out. I think it's perhaps a Swiss-based company that are very good in oncology. And there might be another Swiss-based company in there, and there might be a French company as well. But that would be pure conjecture. But I realise that I've got a very informed audience here, and so I'll take some of the guesswork out of it. They were my guesses. And again, I come back, are these few successes, and there are only 3, down to sustainable value creation, or is it serendipity? And it's unclear. So the last 25 years, I suppose at the beginning were the good old days, and many companies have seen significant value creation over those 25 years. But in that decade of doubt, where we had the sword still there, we've seen value destroyed by about 550 billion, particularly in the last 10 years. That's when the decade of doubt has done its damage. And this has led to this long crisis, and I use the term crisis, in R&D productivity. We have to reverse the trend. We have to find a cure for this crisis, otherwise the industry won't produce those innovative medicines that we need to continue to save lives and make a difference to people's lives. So that leads us to the buzzword of the moment, transformation. All big pharmaceutical companies have developed global strategies to transform their business models and respond to the challenges. And there's been a lot of sound thinking. I think I think there's this audience, you will know many of the things they've deployed. They've tried to do things differently. They've tried to do things better. And I think we've perhaps seen more change over the last 2 or 3 years, not just with reappointment or appointment of new global CEOs and R&D directors, but we've seen a fundamental change in our industry. The industry now is very different to the industry I joined in 1973, and it will continue to be different. And the real challenge for the industry is being able to not do a few things differently and a few things better, but it's to change at scale, to implement things that make a real difference, not just for today, but for tomorrow. So what are they up to? I think before we know what we're up to, we have to agree what are the global challenges. As I said, the company need not only change individual functions and parts of their organisation, they need to change the overall way they operate on a global scale if it's to prosper. I've singled out 5 challenges. You could include, I guess, how to successfully merge and acquire, but I've ignored that for the sake of this one. I think the last time I looked, none of the mergers had created value. So that's perhaps a strategy you want to keep as a last resort. But people will continue to do it. People will continue to do it for a whole bunch of reasons. 2 chief executives get on. 2 chief executives want to keep their jobs. Or you get 2 dinosaurs combining to form one very large, very poorly dinosaur. And if you look at all the mergers that have happened, that last one is very often the case. 2 very large dinosaurs combining to form a very sick, very elderly dinosaur. I won't name companies, by the way. So the key challenges. So delivering shareholder value. The industry needs to regain the support of its shareholders and indeed the other stakeholders that are going to power the R&D portfolio. They need to learn how to operate in a long-term, lower-growth business environment. I'll come on to this. We've talked about R&D, but it's fine pointing out what's gone wrong, but they need to find how to do things differently and better. Part of that is partnering, which we spoke about a little earlier when we were walking across, partnering with academia, partnering with biotech. I think the industry is now facing up to something which is called a loss of trust. Many stakeholders don't trust the pharmaceutical industry. They think they've got their own agenda. They think now they've got the backs to the wall, that agenda is becoming more prominent in the way they think and the way they operate. Also, as the pharmaceutical industry moves into emerging markets, it's got to win the trust of the payors, which are very often the governments of these emerging markets. There's been very little interaction with industry and the governments, and we've seen headlines from China quite recently which have not just been focused on one company, but it's been right across the industry. And we need to learn this balance of mutual respect and trust. And I guess the big elephant in the room, which not many pharmaceutical chief executives talk about, is how to face up to the cost issue. How can they carry on with the innovation, carry on with very high costs of R&D, but charging a fortune for a new pill? And I think we're now starting to see terms like value-based pricing, pricing medicines appropriately and responsibly. So this is the real big elephant in the room. How do we produce? Not only how do we continue to innovate, but how do we produce affordable medicines, particularly in the emerging markets, but not just in the emerging markets. Europe's flat at the moment, completely flat. Some markets are declining quite dramatically, and quite simply in socialised medicine, the governments can't afford the new medicines, so they're having to ration them. We'll address all of these quite quickly, but on an individual basis. So delivering stakeholder value, the balance of factors, if you like, the plus and the minuses, have combined, and it tips it in the balance of negativity. So delivering stakeholder and shareholder value is becoming more difficult, and this will continue to be the case. It's perhaps easier to say what the few positives are. Strong growth in emerging markets. This is the engine of growth over the next 10 years. We'll see flat or decline in Europe. I'll come on to this in the next slide. US pretty much flat. The only real patents continuing to fall, and then some new brands launched, but the engine for growth will be the growth that we see, the dollar growth from emerging markets. Fortunately, we're all getting older, so we live longer, and as we live longer, we need more medicines, particularly in old age. We have seen some price increases in the USA, but they're only headline prices. But behind those, you will see big discounting. So don't be fooled by thinking the US is a cash cow that each year, January the 1st, you can stick up prices. We've seen pandemics, influenza, but other pandemics, which again have put demands on the industry. And we've actually seen payors, be it governments or insurance companies, willing to pay for real innovation. On the negative side, these clearly slightly outweigh the positives. We've seen increasing speed and intensity of competition, increasing rebates. Everyone's getting smarter at purchasing. They all want a discount. And the industry is finding this very difficult to live with. They're passing it on to their suppliers, but they're finding it very difficult to have this conversation about price. In Europe, we're seeing a complete flattening of the market. There's virtually no growth at all in Europe. There's not been for 3 years in dollar growth. Consumption's increasing, but that's mainly generics, so low-value generics. Price is flat, the market's flat. Patent expiry, we've seen big losses with all the big companies due to patent expiries and the loss of branded medicines to generic competition. And the generic competition is ferocious. It used to be a few markets, mainly the Anglo-Saxon markets, US, UK and Germany. Now it's becoming widespread right across Europe. As soon as a drug loses its patent, 1 minute past midnight, and I used to run a generics company as part of Sanofi, we ship product into the trade. 1 minute past midnight. It's that quick. And we hope to take all of the brand within 6 months. Not at the same margins as you get in RX, branded RX, but it's quick and it's effective. Higher regulatory hurdles. It's already the most regulated industry on the planet. Will regulation decrease? No, it's going to increase. Over the next 10 years, we'll see more regulation, and it'll go hand in glove with the lack of trust. So the way of dealing with lack of trust is to introduce, from the payer's perspective, more regulatory hurdles. Greater restrictions on reimbursement, and we've talked about the declining R&D productivity. A few more positives. Industry has started to reduce costs. And most of my friends in other industries is saying your industry has started to behave like a normal industry. We face this level of, this low level of profitability in retail, in virtually every other industry, bar oil and gas, for a long, long time. So my friends in other industries are saying you're now starting to operate in the real world. We've always had strong cash flows, and hopefully they will continue, but in Europe they're not. There's a lot of bad debt in Europe with government at the moment. And the industry has always been able to increase cash returns to shareholders with dividends and share repurchase programs. You look at the dividends that are given out by pharmaceutical companies, and they're not too bad compared to other industries. But as we have to look elsewhere for discovery and innovation, we're doing more deals with academia, more deals with biotech, and that's dilutive. When there's two of you sharing the pie, there is less pie for each. So that's having its impact on not just sales, but also in terms of, more importantly, decreased or declining profitability. Increased legal settlements. I'll come on to that, particularly in the US, but I think Europe will be next with this. The demands on clinical trials, more patients, more time, more cost. Increased filing, both with the FDA and other regulatory bodies around the world. And the M&A activity, I talked briefly about merger and acquisition. I've been through 5. It does stop the company in its tracks. Anyone that says we pick up speed when we merge have never been through a merger. Everybody stops. Have I got a job? Will I want the job? Who will my boss be? Headhunters are on the phone immediately. And it causes a lot of complexity. And I've not seen too many of them be synergistic in terms of making more profit for their shareholders. So all of this means that there's a major shift is required on how the pharmaceutical industry operates. Doing nothing is not an option. It needs to deliver better returns on the investment that the shareholders were willing to put in the past, but I'm not sure the shareholders will continue with that level of investment unless the industry starts to do things differently, starts to do things better, and all of those quite quickly. Okay. A long-term lower growth business environment. I don't know whether you'll be able to see this at the back. This bottom block is the US. The US has always been a considerable part, not only on sales, but it's magnified in terms of profit, leveraged in profit. The US has always been a larger chunk of the market. This is 2010, 2015, 2020. You see the US is flat. Even with those increases, even with that acceptance of innovation, even with the willingness to accept and adopt innovative new medicines, the US is flat. And when every industry executive looks at that, they feel very afraid, because this has been the engine of growth, sales, and more so profits for decades. When we look at Europe, not only is it flat, there's a slight decline. So the Western world, as we call it, is not only mature, it started to tip in the other direction. The emerging markets double in 5 years and then increase by another 50% in the next 5 years. So the emerging markets become the biggest market by 2020. In the other, you've got all sorts of, the rest of the world really, including Africa, Middle East, and you can see that they're showing growth. They almost double over this 10-year period. So the mature markets, flat, growth from emerging markets, and indeed growth from a lower base of the rest of the world. But with that, you've got a downward pressure on margins. And this is caused directly by emerging markets. They're already showing signs of not being willing to pay Western prices for that same level of innovation. They're getting smarter at purchasing. Very often the purchaser is an individual, the new middle class. Take India, for instance, and they say, no, we'll buy off the internet. We'll buy more smartly. So that you're going to see that, and this is a projection from IMS Health and KPMG, the margin that the industry enjoyed at 48% pre-R&D margin in 2010 is set to decline 5 percentage points to 43% by 2020. This is another way of looking at it. So this is numbers are slightly different. This is from Booz & Company, the consultancy. Here you see down at the bottom North America and EU. Again, they're showing a slight increase in North America. Japan starting to increase again, having been pretty much flat for the last 15 years, really. The BRIC countries really being the engine of growth. So Brazil, Russia, India and China going up 2.5-fold in terms of revenues in 6 years. And why? Well, a whole variety of factors, series of factors and different factors. In the emerging markets, they're enjoying a fast pace of growth, unmet need, large populations that are growing older, populations where we're starting to treat diabetes, a huge amount of diabetes, cancer, etc. But they do face competition from local companies, so the industry is starting to get their heads around that. There's always the risk of compulsory licensing, and I think recently we've seen this in one of the major markets in the BRIC countries. Patients do pay a significant amount of their costs, and there's a limit to how much they will pay. And in the public segment, I think here of China and Brazil, nearly all the sales are procured via tender or contract. And we're starting to see the unfortunate side of that in terms of governance in China right now, where industry has been accused of malpractice. In Europe and the Western markets, there's slow growth, limited potential over the next few years, more hurdles to market access, and there's downward pressure on cost. Just concentrate briefly on Europe. Just 2 slides. This is a new study from A.T. Kearney. I have to point out a typo. I read this presentation 3 times. I can't blame it on anyone other than myself. That's not 75, it's 25. Even I've not been around 75 years. So they've had a tough time, and we've seen organisations change quite dramatically in Europe. Much smaller than they were. Countries are being grouped together in the Northern European, rather than having a subsidiary in the UK, Denmark, Sweden, Finland. They're grouping Netherlands. They're grouping them all together. So traumatic cost reductions, and it's not the end of it. Further cost reductions will be required if they're going to succeed in the future. 2010 was where there was a turning point in public sector spending, and reminding ourselves that the private market in Europe is virtually non-existent, a few digits, 2 or 3%, and growth fell from 5% to 0, and some countries are declining as much as 7%. So in short, pipelines are drying up, few blockbusters are in sight, and the public coffers are becoming exhausted. The public pockets are empty. And that's not going to change very quickly either. So what was the A.T. Kearney? It's a good report, actually. It's only just been published. They need to devise a radically different model organised around customers, not products. That could be said of the whole of the global pharmaceutical industry, not just Europe. I referred to this slide earlier. Emerging markets are the key. This shows the growth projected by IMS from 2010 to 2015, where there is some brand growth, so some new products are still being launched, but it's being virtually offset by continued patent cliffs, patent expiries. Generics continue from a small base, large volume base, but small dollar base to increase, mainly picking up the stuff that comes out of patent expiries. Emerging markets are the real engine of growth. That's what's driving the market forward over the next few years. Pre-R&D profits, talked about this. We're seeing sales not halting. The market's still going to grow 3 or 4% globally. There's going to be a decline in margins, fueled mainly by, ironically, the sector that's growing. The emerging markets will continue to buy, but they'll buy at cheaper prices. Poor and inadequately measured R&D. This is always a tricky slide. This shows the new drug approvals in the US. So we've always said it's slowed. In actual fact, it has, so you can see that it's virtually flattened. There's been a few more in 2011, 2012. They are looking better, but there's no basis to assume the number of new drug approvals in the US by the FDA, which influences, to be quite honest, the rest of the world, is set to increase. I see it flat or flattish over the next 5-7 years. But at the same time, we're approving less new medicines, but we're spending more money on medicines, on developing medicines. So fewer new drug approvals, but the spend is increasing. And why have we got this poor post-tax return on R&D? Well, there's 3 reasons that I've isolated. Most of the low-hanging fruit, most of that stuff that was easy to discover, where there was an unmet need in hypertension or indeed even in more chronic disorders like diabetes, most of that low-hanging fruit has been picked. I'm not saying R&D is easy, but it was easier in the past than it is today. The regulatory environment remains challenging. It's very risk-averse. Doesn't want patients to face unnecessary risk. But it's maybe the pendulum's gone too far. That clearly, if you've got a terminal disease, if me or a member of my family had a terminal disease, I would perhaps want to take a few risks with innovation. I would perhaps want to take a few risks with drugs that are at a late stage of development, so they'd prove safety, maybe not prove complete efficacy, but I think we'll see a population which is more informed, which is ageing, which are willing to take more risks. And the patient has to be more engaged in this decision-making process. You'll see, when I look to the future, you'll see that the patient comes out very strongly as someone that we need to consult with. And I think the industry has been very weak at weeding out low-quality compounds. When you talk to the market, and I've done this many times in my various countries, we always said we've got, 1,001 products in the pipeline. We never made any attempt to say which were the stars, which were good quality and which were poor quality. It was quantity that mattered, not quality. And indeed, I think what this meant was there was an overcapacity of R&D, because we're all spending 16% of it. When I know some companies looked at the productivity of their R&D, so of that asset, which was laboratories, people, very expensive equipment, what was the utilisation rate? In the hotel business, I guess you'd want, 80% of your rooms filled, 85%. Guess what it was for the industry at large, the global number? Less than 30%. So there was overcapacity. And it was like the curate's egg. It was poor in parts. So someone needs to take a critical look at the volume of R&D that's taking place and the value that's creating. So R&D productivity has, the spend, we've gone over this, it's risen relentlessly. Its level of adding value has sunk to all-time low, and clearly this is an unsustainable rate. We know all about this. We've covered it in the past. And when I was talking about how to describe the pipeline, and I've heard myself saying this when the analysts have said, or the Financial Times, so, Nigel, how strong is Company X's pipeline? I've said it's one of the best. It's uniquely broad. I always try and say something different, so if I got quoted in the Financial Times, people didn't look back and say, well, he always says that. It's the strongest. It's the most productive. It's peer leading. I never actually said it's one of the weakest in the industry, or that our utilisation rate of global R&D asset was less than 30%. And I think that's the type of honesty that investors and stakeholders in the industry will expect in the future. when I look into the crystal ball. I think R&D spending needs to be more flexible. We need a better interrogation, not just by the analysts, but by the stakeholders, by employees, by the R&D directors, of pipeline quality. And I think we should only pursue those real opportunities that can make a real difference to patients' lives. We're seeing quite a few projects cancelled. If you read First Word or any prism onto the industry, I've just read today a company I've got an investment in. They've cancelled a very late product in cancer, and they were ready to launch next year. So I think we'll see more of that. It was a product in a very rare cancer as well, where even in a part year next year, the analysts were predicting $300 million worth of sales. And last week we saw 2 or 3 companies again cancelling projects. And we have to dismantle this fixed R&D structure, much as we did with manufacturing. When I was with Sanofi, we did a merger or an acquisition every 3.5 weeks for 20 years. That's how we grew little Sanofi into the biggest company in Europe and the 3rd biggest company in the world. So when you look at the parentage of Sanofi, there was Sterling Health, there was Romperlank, there was Mayhem Baker, Roussel, etc. And when we did the last one, which was Aventis, where they were twice as big as we were in sales, I think the purchase price was 67 billion euros or dollars. They were perhaps very similar, it didn't matter. The analyst's first question was, how many manufacturing centres have you got around the world? And we said, we added them all up, 82, say, or 83. They said, well, really, you only need 8. And that's what's happened. Acquisition after acquisition after acquisition, added, and it was the same in R&D. And now what you've seen is the streamlining of manufacturing into those emerging markets where you can build brand new, more efficient facilities. And I think what we're going to see over the next 3 to 5 years is a dismantling of that, what to date has been that fixed R&D infrastructure. That's what I hope to see. We're already the most regulated industry on the planet, but I think regulation is set to increase. There's a report called Fit for the Future 2020, which was produced by INSEAD. I don't reference it in these slides. I was part of the group that put it together, where we asked 20 global chief executives to predict their strategy for 2020. And everyone, to a man and a woman, said this industry is already highly regulated, but more regulation will continue. And I think what we've seen, you can read there, I'm not going to go in sake of time, I'm not going to read them all through, but you can see in the US the number of pharmaceutical industry settlements with state and federal government. 1991 to 2010. I was running the US around this period. Wasn't an issue. Wasn't an issue. And this is usually a fine for marketing malpractice. Look what's happened over the last few years. Number of cases reaching 1 a week. The next slide shows what it's costing the industry. So this is the value of settlement with US government, mainly for promoting products off license or promoting an indication that's not fully approved, etc. And you can see that it's been very punitive on the industry to get their attention. So 2009, $4.4 billion fines to the industry, 4.4 billion. Little less in 2010. But then just what happened a couple of weeks ago, as I was putting this presentation together, November the 6th, the day after bonfire night in the UK, November the 6th, J&J were fined $2.2 billion to settle the US probe over the marketing of one of their CNS products. And the comment from the US Attorney General was, the conduct at issue in this case jeopardised the health and safety of patients and damaged the public trust. So I think the FDA have said, we've fined the industry, but we've not yet got their attention. We're now going to really, really try and hurt them where it hurt, in the pocket. 2.2 billion. The fourth point is along with these fines and along with the various scandals that we hear about from time to time, we're losing the loss of trust, both with governments and stakeholders, both of them, both groups. We need to make sure this industry is fit for purpose, not just for today, but the future. Change needs to start at the top, improve board governance. There needs to be a root and branch review right across the... I know it's difficult when you employ 100, 150,000 people and maybe 400,000 as partners in R&D and manufacturing, but it needs to occur. It needs to be done by external experts. Self-audit is no longer an option, I don't think, for the industry. And the bar has to be set at a very high level. This industry has to be the best governed of any industry. Mind you, if I was making a presentation to all executives, I'd perhaps also say the same to them as well. It has to be, you have to aim to be the best, better than any other industry sector. They need a more dynamic approach to risk reporting, both to stakeholders and indeed to shareholders, with greater disclosure of potential and actual risk. Difficult for this industry, because it's always been quite a confidential industry, not used to reporting things that go wrong. Now, the elephant in the room is, okay, if we get better at R&D, can we afford it? Will there still be enough patients out there, not just rich patients, but patients that can benefit from our medicines, that can afford to pay for those medicines? The projections are that, in absolute terms, healthcare and drug spend will continue to grow over the next 5 to 6 years. Indeed, over the next 10 years, we're around 5 or 6%. So the expectations from the industry is that, yes, people will continue to spend on healthcare. Will that come to fruition? We'll have to see. This spending is, or this projected spending, is happening against a backdrop of increasing debt, particularly with governments that are the payors, raising the question of sustainability. And there we show the various countries, Italy down here, all the way to EU, US market, with their debt as a percentage of their GDP. Very interesting slide. No time to go through all of it at the moment, but I think you can think that maybe this projection is optimistic that global spending on healthcare and medicines in particular will continue to rise at that level when a lot of companies have got an unsustainable debt to try and feed. And debt as a percentage of GDP continues to rise. Now, and I can talk about value-based pricing. We've just finished the negotiations in the UK, which will be implemented quite soon. It's the PPRS scheme, the origin of the value-based price system. Value-based pricing, which will be implemented by NICE, National Institute of Clinical Excellence. I've been involved in 3 of these. I was involved on the periphery of the last one. And that'll affect maybe 20 or 30 markets in terms of their willingness to pay for new medicines. I.e. they're not willing to pay an increased price for the next level of innovation. But this is a report I read from McKinsey, February of this year. It uses the US as a model, and it says out there's a $1 trillion prize to secure for someone that goes out and grabs that market and delivers better healthcare at a more affordable cost. Not just medicines at a lower cost, but better healthcare at a more affordable cost. And they're using outcomes-based payments to address the US healthcare financing crisis. And they make several points here. I won't go through them, but they say, largely, whatever we tried to regain that or to take back that spend that's clearly out of control, we've largely failed. Outcome-based payments have failed, failed to address real patient needs. This third point, and it's substantiated in the report, that the cost difference, usually when we buy, let's take a car, I like cars. So if we buy an expensive sports car, we expect something different to buying a budget hatchback. It looks different, it goes quicker, it goes faster, it's flashier, it's got leather interior, etc. In the US, they've actually found that cost is not making any discernible difference to care quality or outcomes. That, to me, was revelation. So you pay more money, you don't get a better product. Think of any other market. Doesn't exist, does it? So 5 sets of changes are required. If someone's going to claim this prize, by the way, they'll have to. The rabbit's out of the hat now. You know, they've said how it can be achieved, so somebody will have to go out there and grab it. And that's what US do. They're good pioneers. They go out and they'll say, OK, we're going to do it now. So the need to help redefine expectations and consistency of care from providers. The transition to outcome-based payment needs to happen at scale, right across the country. And it needs to be based on different outcomes. You pay more money, you get different outcomes. Focus on episodes of care. Public and private sector, big issue in the States, needs to collaborate. And we need to share more information. We all need to be part of this big data party. This is the $1 trillion prize. If you're interested in pricing of medicines and healthcare, I'd advise you to read it. It's the most informative document I've read to date. And you can imagine everything we could throw at the UK government as we were trying to negotiate higher prices in the UK. We got McKinsey's, KPMG, etc. to source it for us. We failed to convince them, by the way, but we tried. And it goes through that chain where they identify the low-hanging fruit, what needs to be done today to start to release some of that trillion, the harder stuff, and all the way through to how future innovation can help us reclaim that $1 trillion prize. Once it's been claimed in the US, I would imagine that model will rattle around the world at a rate of knots. I won't go into that, no time. So today's transformation has brought significant and critical challenges. I focused on 5. Industries responded. They've all got a strategy in place to respond to those challenges. But the jury's still out. There will be winners, there will be losers. Right, very quickly into the future. So we're now into the future. I think there's 5 slides, so we're almost there, and then we've got some time for questions. This is looking at the industry, what we're doing today, basis of competitive advantage today, and a projection of how competitive advantage will be secured in 2020. What are we doing today? What do we need to do differently and better over the next 5 or 6 years? And there are some recurring themes. The second chapter is all about pricing. So today, and this is a model the industry's used, you discover a new product and you charge 15 to 20% more than the previous product. Not very sophisticated. And I've been in companies where we've done global pricing and we've done a lot of research and we said, this market will pay X for it, this company will pay Y. We've now got a global pricing strategy and the chief executive has said, what does company X or the brand leader pay for their product? And we said $20, we'll charge $25. Displace the research at a board meeting. That is no longer sustainable. For the future, pricing of pharmaceuticals, pricing of healthcare, thinking about the $1 trillion prize, has to be based on the ability to pay. It has to be affordable. We're no longer in the business of providing pills for very rich people. It has to be affordable healthcare. Medicines have to be affordable. And we need to look at a different scale of profitability from the industry. We need to look at and set the expectations of stakeholders and shareholders at that declining level of profitability. Because unless we can live with a declining level of profitability, we won't make the top line. We won't sell the products at very high prices. There will be fewer competitors in a broader range of diseases. Now that sounds counterintuitive to this R&D productivity drying up, but more and more energy will be spent on those rare and orphan diseases. So those where there's not too much competition. You take companies like Genzyme, where they've focused in, and Sanofi paid a great deal of money, $22 billion for Genzyme, where they've focused exclusively on some very rare and orphan diseases. I was part of that merger, and when I got the products back to the UK, I saw that this company, Genzyme, it's in the public domain, were generating most of their sales from 91 patients in the UK. I didn't need a large sales force to go and see them. I could invite them all round for supper. Very different to promoting a general practice product where when we were competing that primary care market, at the peak I had 1,500 reps, just in the UK. In these rare and orphan diseases, it's very often your advocate, your ambassador is the prescribing clinician, because they're a specialist. So you don't need a large sales force. And there's also less competition. It's very tricky science. Very, very tricky science. Route to market is quicker because there's an unmet need. People die. But, you know, in some of these rare and orphan diseases, you look at a company like Alexion in the States with a drug called Solaris, the average cost per patient per year is $450,000 US. And that company turns over 1.3 billion with one drug, and it's capitalized at 25 billion. And they've only got a few hundred patients worldwide. So that's a very attractive sector for the industry to start to get involved in. Outsourcing is something that the industry started to do rather reluctantly. We started with sales forces. We've now embraced R&D. But I think the industry, just as my friends say, get real, Nigel. You're now in a competitive market. You're just an ordinary industry. You're going to have to look at outsourcing IT because you're no longer world experts at it. We had that conversation earlier. You know, you've been slow to adopt the social media. You know, retail's way ahead of, and groceries, way ahead of the pharmaceutical industry. Only a few companies have really embraced social media to date, including e-health. So the industry's got to up its game and be more open to innovation from new technologies. This is a key area. 4 or 5 years ago, I've chaired many biotech companies. Pharma said, we don't need biotech. You know, we can do research much better than biotech. Guess what? 4 or 5 years later, biotech is providing more of the new discovery. Tufts University produced a report last year where it said they said that 70% of innovation, 72%, I think, from the Tufts report, was going to come from biotech companies. Dramatic change. Focus on emerging markets, we've covered that. R&D has to be more predictable and also not spend that constant 15, 16%, but pick out the real stars in the pipeline. If it needs 25% of sales going behind one product, take the risk, take the gamble, because the prizes, the rewards will be there. The emphasis is going to be on volume. It's always been on how can we launch very highly priced, not too innovative, me too products and make them a blockbuster. In the future, it's going to be a much larger market. We'll have to address the needs of the emerging markets, where the skills are very often different. And we're going to have to start to produce products specifically for the emerging markets. Otherwise, we won't be able to sell them. And we need transparent and simpler business models that are easier to understand. And I've talked about an industry that is better managed and better governed. I think the whole thing with R&D, and you'll notice there is a recurring theme. If we could get better in R&D, we wouldn't be facing a crisis. We'd be facing doing things differently and doing things better, but we wouldn't be facing a crisis. And we need to focus more on the internal rate of return to measure and also compare the profitability of that investment. Not just saying it's the best pipeline, it's mega, whatever terms I've used in the past. It will be hard measures. What is your return on that investment that you're making? How does it compare to Sanofi? How does it compare to Merck? That's what we've got to get better at as an industry. So, 5 tips. So if you're running a pharmaceutical company, and I came in to consult, putting merger and acquisition to one side, what are the 5 things I'd advise, the 5 strategies? Remember, these are not just strategies. A lot of companies identify the strategy and then fail to implement. And that's common across all industries, I think. And the first one is, do you have the right product portfolio? And the products that you need for the future, certainly in the next 6, 7 years, need to take into account the needs of not just the Western markets, America and Europe, but they must take into account the needs of consumers in emerging markets. How using your marketing sales infrastructure? Industry started to change its model, this carpet bombing with large rep forces, my 1,500 in the UK. They've started to trim back, but they must accelerate that modernisation of the sales and marketing, not only in the Western markets, but also the emerging markets. And the focus must be in the emerging markets on not just making a quick dollar or a quick euro or a quick pound. It must be on the longer term, building up trust, building up a true partnership with payers, building up a true partnership with patients. And I mentioned it before, but this industry has been very, very slow at embracing social media and e-health, mobile health, and that can't continue. Number 3, acquire more talent. Again, the industry has always said we can learn from other industries. They've said it as a strategy, but they've never delivered it. I can only think of one global chief executive that came from another industry. Came from not McDonald's, sorry? No, it was from the, what's the other big hamburger chain in the US? Not Burger King. Came from it was a lawyer from Burger King who joined Pfizer. And he lasted a very short period of time. Not to say that he was a failure, but the industry has got into the habit of promoting its own, breeding people internally and promoting them. If you look at the boards of big pharma, top 20 companies, less than 20% of the board or leadership team came from other industries. And most of those are in the finance area. Not R&D, not global chief executive, not IT, not IT even, finance. Do you have the right oversight on R&D returns? I've told you about that. We need not words to describe the R&D efforts. We need to weed out the weak ones. We need to resource the products that can make a real difference, the medicines, and we need an industry-wide measurement stick for measuring the productivity of R&D. Is your corporate governance market leading? The answer is no, but it needs to be. The recipe for future success, it's not that difficult. When I was president of the pharma industry, I had a manifesto that said, this was what, 2005, 2007, which I not only sold to my own UK government, it was Tony Blair at the time, Prime Minister, but also when I was an ambassador for the UK, I sold to America and the Far East and Japan. And it was the right medicine for the right patient at the right time. Every payer I presented to always reminded me, Nigel, at the right price. And of course it has to be at the right price, but the industry ducked that one for a long, long time. The vision I think that gives us as an industry is simpler for investors to understand. It's structured simpler. Even though developing new medicines is not going to get any easier, it might even become more complex. And that's when we need biotechnology. But it will be more transparent, easier to understand. It's going to put patients at the centre. Right now we put specialists at the centre. That $1 trillion prize will be claimed by putting patients right at the centre. I chaired a series of meetings with global R&D directors in the King's Fund in London recently and then in Harvard in the States. I didn't think I'd get them all in the same room because they usually fight like cat and dog. They didn't. What do they want to talk about? Engaging with patients, getting patients to tell us how they're coping with their existing therapy, getting patients' ideas in that very early stage of R&D, and not just going to patients to get their support when we launch a product, or the other side of the coin, to get the support of the patient associations when we meet an unexpected side effect and don't want the drug to be withdrawn. So putting patients at the centre of healthcare is something that we've got to do, and we've got to do it because we'll be a more effective industry and we'll be an industry that wins back the trust of patients and other people, payers and everyone. At this conference, and I think there were 64 people in the States, 18 in the UK that I chaired, we spent a lot of time describing what a patient was, and I thought this would be easy. Now, these are all very clever fellows and blokes and girls. They said, no, but what is a patient? None of us want to be patients. And we actually said, I don't want to be a patient. I'm getting older. I want to stay as fit and live as long as my grandma, who lived to be 103. That's what I want. I don't want to be regarded as a patient. And what we decided was that none of us did, irrespective of what age you were. What we wanted from our healthcare providers, including the pharmaceutical industry, was to get healthy and then give us the assistance to stay healthy. And that was my it was the same in Europe when we did it with the European Eye, and the same in the States. So they were my two key learnings from what we need to take responsibility for, both for ourselves, because one day, unfortunately, we will be all patients, but also as an industry. And I told you I joined the industry in 1973 when I joined as a medical rep with Wellcome, with GSK. But I was actually born in 1950. And one of my guiding principles, and this is, I was born in August 1950, was from the guy that set up Merck Shot and Down. And if you actually just take time to read it, this was his guiding principle to what was a very, very successful pharmaceutical company. Still is. We try never to get that patients are substituted healthcare in the 2013 version is for people. Remember, he didn't say patients even then. He said it's not for profits. The profits follow, and if we remember that, they've never failed to appear. That was true in 1950, and I think it'll be true in 2020. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, sir. Could you take your seat?
I'm not disappearing.
We'll have a Q&A session now. May I now invite Mr. Krishna Kumar Nallur, Associate Director of the Institute of Innovation and Entrepreneurship from SMU, to help us to facilitate the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel, for that very enlightening talk. I have quite a few questions, but I guess I'll take that. I'll take that offline, and I'll allow the audience to ask a few questions. A small request: could you keep it succinct so that more people can ask questions? Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for being here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this your presentation. I have to say, I started my career just 5 years after you did, as a doctor. I have not seen what you said before, fundamental shift in the business model. And I don't see that happening right now also. I talk of a fundamental shift in the business model. So perhaps you could comment on that. Another thing that I thought was somewhat lacking from the analysis is what do the whole healthcare, what do the healthcare providers, what role are they going to play? Because I've been in a situation that you go to a doctor and he wants to prescribe the most expensive medicine. Yeah. He has an ulterior motive to do that. That's what we're seeing right now in China. So I think that somehow has to be brought into the picture too. The pharma industry has been very poor, as you know, in developing trust. In fact, they're pretty much at the low, very, very low when it comes to trust. Yeah. But perhaps you can comment on also on the role the medical profession is playing or is not playing when it comes to reducing healthcare costs.
Okay, no, I think they're all all relevant points. When I joined the industry in '73, the model was very simple. The business model was very simple. There was a lot of low-hanging fruit. So to get a better antihypertensive, something to lower the blood pressure, was pretty simple. The drugs had lots of side effects for what we determine as silent disease. When you've got raised blood pressure, you don't know it until you go and see the doctor and he measures your blood pressure and he says, you've got raised blood pressure, hypertension. He'll then put you on a drug, in those days, in 1973, and within a week or a few weeks, you'd either developed a rash, or if you're a man, you become impotent, and you're having headaches. And you're having to take this drug 4 times a day. Needless to say, when you've got a rash, a headache, and you're impotent, you tend to think, I think the disease is better than the cure. So compliance was pretty awful. But it was also pretty easy to come up with a drug that actually started to eliminate those side effects. So an R&D actually got hold of some of that low-hanging fruit, and by the time we got to the ACE2 inhibitors, drugs like irbesartan, the side effect profile was very similar to placebo. So you actually lowered the blood pressure, and you didn't know that you were being treated. You knew you were taking, and the pills by this time were once a day. So the old model was, for R&D, incremental improvement. For the industry, send out lots of medical reps that were pharmacists or science graduates and convince individual prescribers to use your drug. That model has changed quite dramatically over the last 40 years. Now the prescribing is not left to the individual physician. There are more D&T formularies. In the new economies, in the emerging markets, it's a contract business to get on those formularies. Even in Europe and certainly in America, you've not got huge army of reps carpet bombing individual doctors. You actually make your application, you make your case. Very often there's a fourth hurdle, the health technology assessment, that if you've not got approval and support from NICE, in the case of the UK, or the D&T Formula Committee in the States, you don't need reps. One drug in the UK, I couldn't get it through NICE, so I got rid of the reps in that particular business unit because it was no good promoting. Because even if they convinced the physician, he couldn't prescribe and get reimbursed. So I think the business model has changed and will continue to change. And at the end of the presentation, I talked about rare orphan diseases. Well, you don't need reps. You just need to convince the specialists to take responsibility for treatment. And R&D clearly ran into a brick wall. That low-hanging fruit disappeared. We plucked it. We spent more money but achieved less. And the incremental benefits of Me Too drugs made sure you couldn't command a premium price. So I think the business model's changed. The R&D model has certainly changed. The trust issue, I think, has always been bad in North America. Very bad. Where I think politicians and traffic wardens and the drug industry enjoyed a very low level of regard. Interestingly, in the UK, where it's now our biggest earner of revenue to the Treasury, it's highly admired. And at the other end of the spectrum, we now hate bankers and policemen more. So the industry has gone up in the elevator whilst other people have been coming down. The role of the physician going forward will clearly be very important. That's that very important relationship with the patient. But if you had to single out anyone that's going to be the most important player going forward, it's going to be the patient. Patients will get involved at an earlier stage. They'll take self-responsibility. They don't want to be a patient. They want to get healthy and stay healthy.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Thank you, Nigel. Raymond from BC.com. We are UK Telehealth. Maybe you can share with us the formula that you have suggested right in hand. Does it apply to an emerging market medical industry like China? And there's other places whereby things are slightly different than what you are. I mean, those are new practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think even in Europe, before we go into the emerging markets, the old model that I described is still very prevalent. You've still got reps that are usually very often doctors in Eastern Europe calling on doctors and convincing their mates and their colleagues to prescribe their product. It's going to change quite quickly. It's not going to take 20 years. In the new markets, I think at the moment we're about to face a huge change. I think, and we're starting to see it in China with this trust issue that's emerging. We're seeing it in Brazil, we're seeing it in India, we're seeing it in Russia. Whereas the purchasing drugs is going to be central, or at least statewide. Does that mean you need reps? No, you need people that can actually put the benefits of your drug forward. Does it mean you have to be flexible on price? Of course it means you have to be flexible on price. So I think the changes are very different to claiming the $1 trillion prize in the US, but I think it's still going to involve collaboration and a building of trust to occur between the industry and the payors, which are, as you know, very often government. And it'll need a full harnessing of the new technology. One of the great advantages we've got in these new emerging markets is that we've got new technology already established. The technology in China and everywhere from in Asia is far more developed than in the UK. I mean, in the UK, we can't even hold patient records electronically. And we've had many failed attempts. As you know, we spent billions on it. So we've got antique systems. And I went to see my doctor the other day, and he said, let me get your patient notes out. They're in a large manila envelope. And he said, you were vaccinated with diphtheria when you were 5. I thought, well, that's interesting. That was about the only note he had in this manila envelope. So I've lived in 7 different countries on 4 different continents. So I don't know where my healthcare records are, in cyberspace maybe. So I think we've got many advantages in the newer markets to take advantage of to exploit the new technology as a true partner.
So I have 2 questions, please. The first one is about regulation.
Yeah.
You talked about several times, you said that there was increasing regulatory hurdles.
Yeah.
I'm wondering where you think that's coming from. Is it
Shall I take that one, or do you want? Okay, so I'll take that one. We'll come back to you. So I think coming from two different directions, and I think they started with affordability. So you used to get a drug, develop a drug, put your dossier into the FDA, put it into the European regulators, which have increasingly become centralised, rather than state by state. Once you had approval for your product licence, you could launch. In some countries, you had to negotiate price, but in the UK, Switzerland, Germany, you could launch, as you could with the FDA. We then found that in most situations, there was a rising healthcare cost, which was taking up at least 9–10% of GDP. So governments who were the major players in Europe, not necessarily in the States, actually said, we can't afford this innovation, particularly with the new cancer drugs. And remember, over the last few years, over 60% of R&D spend has been in oncology. So when the new drugs came out for breast, well, all sorts of cancers, they said, the UK government said, we can't afford them. So we'll introduce what they called the fourth hurdle, which was, can we afford it? And this was a body, NICE, set up by the UK government to advise the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister whether we could afford, the NHS could afford this new innovation. And it was a very effective model at rationing. The reason it was sent up, by the way, by the politicians was to reduce postcode prescribing, so we had equality of care. What it led to was quite the reverse. With the new oncology agents, very few were approved in the UK, yet 22 kilometres away, 22 miles away in France, they were all made available. So it was a rationing mechanism based on affordability. The regulations that are now appearing, with the FDA flatlining approvals, are all based on that judgment of risk. Can we, post-Vioxx, if you remember, it was an anti-rheumatic, a non-steroidal, where my wife took it and she stockpiled it when we knew it was going to, and she still takes it to this day, because she's not one of the very, very tiny percentage of patients that have to suffer the side effects. So I think the slower approval rate of new drugs is based on risk in some countries and affordability in others. And there is more red tape. I tried to kill red tape across Europe. It's a hopeless task. You know, you're taking a pea shooter to slay the dragon. Well, as long as we've got Brussels and Europe, we're going to have more red tape, unfortunately. And I'm not anti-Europe, but I think we should look at that risk-benefit ratio and make medicines, give access to patients more quickly rather than more slowly. And you had a second set.
The second one is about the cost issue. So you talk about the fact that R&D, what we've seen in the last 10 years is R&D spend has gone up as a percentage of the
Sales.
And notwithstanding, we've got no product in the pipeline, and yet at the same time you talk about the need for affordable medicines. So the medicines number one, have to be there, firstly, and number two, they have to be the price that people can afford to pay. So there seems to be a bit of a disconnect. If we've got more and more money going into developing less and less, how are we going to have something that's affordable for people to pay? You can't, I see that you're talking about other places where the industry can cut costs, and that's fine, but if they still don't have any product, they're going very quickly out of business.
Okay, so I think what we're going to see worldwide, and we are seeing, and I think the trend's accelerating quite quickly, is that when you lose patent protection after the 10 years or 11 years, in some countries they carried on using the brand, which was crazy, because there was a multi-source of affordable generics, which very often were a tenth of the price, and they were of the same high quality. In the early days, quality was an issue, I have to admit. But I think nowadays it's no longer an issue. I mean, a lot of the products that are produced in the emerging countries, India being a big producer of generics, their plants are FDA inspected, FDA approved. Very often they're of the same, if not higher quality than the original brand. So I think affordable medicines are there for all, and a lot of that will be taken up by generics. Of the volume, 70% could be filled by generics. Right now it's perhaps only 20%. So we've still got a long way to go with affordable medicines. I think what most governments and insurance companies are still saying, that if you come up with something which is truly innovative, there is a price we will pay for innovation. And the fact that in a rare disorder, I'm talking about Solaris, the Alexion drug, the insurers, even these hard-nosed insurers in the US and in Europe, are willing to pay €450,000 a year to treat one patient, is testament to that. Oh, I think there'll be fewer companies.
We need people, but we need people to treat cancer and cardiovascular disease and diabetes, not just the rare disease.
Oh, no, they will. This will continue. Remember, it takes 12, 15 years to bring a drug to the market. For 10 years, we've been spending 64% of global R&D on two areas of medicine, oncology and CNS, dementia, diseases of the elderly. Those drugs will start to arrive, have arrived in oncology, and will continue to rise. On the reverse side of the coin, 15 years ago, we had an antibiotic for all infections, and the industry stopped doing research on anti-infectives. Guess what? The bugs came back and nipped us on the bum. You know, we've now got resistant strains. There was a thing today in the UK. There's an article being produced where coming up to winter, mums are taking kids to doctors, to GPs, and saying, he's got a runny nose, give him antibiotics. And they're advising doctors to say no. This is what we've been doing for far too long. So once the industry takes its eye off the ball, and most of the innovation comes from the industry. You know, there's been a few drugs that have been produced by government, but not too many. So I think the level of spend will continue to be high. I don't see it declining. But the weaker candidates, the Me Too drugs, need to be weeded out earlier, and there needs to be a measurement stick so that you can really concentrate on life-changing drugs, drugs that change morbidity, drugs that change mortality, personalised medicines, new vaccines. I was lucky enough in my old company to launch the first cancer vaccine. I never thought in my lifetime I'd see for cervical cancer. I never thought I'd see a vaccine. We'll soon see a vaccine for AIDS, for HIV-related diseases. So the innovation will continue, but the industry's got to get better at doing things differently in R&D and not just plucking this low-hanging fruit for another Prozac or another antihypertensive. It has to go into real serious areas of medicine and then go further, because the dosage I need as a 63-year-old overweight male might be very different to a very fit 18-year-old underweight female. So and I might respond very differently. So we need to go further and faster. Yeah. And diagnostics, of course. I mean, I share your same hopes. And I think it will be dictated, because those that don't do it won't be successful. No one's really pushed the boat out. Ironically, it was Glaxo in China, where Andrew Whitty, the global chief executive, said very publicly he was going to sell parts of his business off for a specific reason, because he was going to use the funds that he got from these medicines not to try and force fit. These were normally over-the-counter remedies, which are a large part of healthcare solutions in all markets, but particularly in Asia. He was selling off this asset, so rather than force-feed these products into China, he could develop products that were specific for those markets, that looked at traditional medicines, looked at delivery of healthcare, looked at local partnerships, etc. Ironically, Glaxo, one of the first companies, was singled out in China for what potentially will be legal action, I think. But they rapidly followed. So I think the successful companies perhaps did make a quick buck, but I don't think that's sustainable. I think they'll have to look at local partnerships. They'll also have to look about the talent they use to manage their subsidiaries. Because it's no good taking somebody like me and saying, well, you've done very well running North America and bits of Europe, Nigel. Go and run China. You know, the chances are I'm going to fail because I will use the techniques, I will use the history, my experience of being relatively successful in North America and Europe. So I think the industry needs to be better at bringing in talent, and particularly in the management, but also employees that are fit for purpose in their markets. Yeah. It's the same in India as well. I mean, it's. Yeah.
We'll, we'll take one last question.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, only recently a company out of China with French money came to me and said, can we raise some money in Europe? Because we've got an innovative combination of 5 drugs, actually, for the symptomatic treatment of patients that had a stroke. And we're seriously having a look at it. So one more
last question.
Oh, got it. Hi.
I'm Shireen. I'm from the R&D. So I'm interested in your statement about reducing R&D costs, but yet you want to generate more different types of drugs.
Yeah.
So how do you plan to do that? Well, so one of the steps you say is collaboration with academia and biotech.
Yeah.
So what are the steps a company will probably, what kind of collaboration are they most interested in? I guess that's the first question. The second question that I have is infrastructure. So right now, the current infrastructure is to make like very few drugs, but in large volumes. But now the future is going to make many, many different types of drugs, but in smaller, I guess, smaller quantity. So what kind of infrastructure shift do you see in the biopharma industry?
I think, and I missed your first question, so I'll come back to it. The biggest shift we're going to see into global organisation is far more outsourcing and partnership forming. The industry did this a little bit with CSOs, contract sales organisations, with companies like Quintiles, Innovex, etc. So when you launched a drug, you'd hire in a bunch of reps. When you started to reach peak performance, you'd ease back on the gas. Then we started to do it in late-stage research, CROs, in phase 3. Now what you see with R&D is that the outsourcing of R&D is equal right across the various phases of R&D. So no longer just phase 4, phase 3, it's right the way across. And that is set to accelerate. There'll be more partnerships with biotech, these small companies, maybe only a dozen people in some cases, more with academia, more with startups, where they can bring drugs to the market or to a late stage far quicker because they've got none of the constraints of large companies and the decision-making processes that very often occur in large companies, and far cheaper. You see, most biotechs that reach phase 2, the so-called valley of death, because that's when the costs really start to ramp up, have got there by spending no more than $30 or $40 million. In a big pharma company, a top 20, you've perhaps spent the best part of a billion plus. So how can biotech do it for a fraction of the price? I know that a biotech company that I chair, that we're now phase 3 and ready to sell, it's an anti-infective, we were very reluctant when we got Piper Jaffray to sell the product for us, sell the company for us, because they said, how much have you invested? I won't tell you how much we'd invested, but it was a mere fraction of the $2 billion that Big Pharma would have to spend to get a drug in stage 3. And we were reluctant to tell the market, because they thought, well, they'll have gone round some corners, they'll have done. We hadn't. All the people were in the company, in the biotech company, most of them were ex-Pfizer, people I'd worked with in the past. And you put them in a different environment, and they can do things differently, and very often they can do things faster. And also, when you get some of the work done by the academics, you go to an academic, and if my business card I say Pfizer, Sanofi, or GSK, how much will it cost to conduct this study? It's got lots of noughts behind it. If I go as an entrepreneur, as a biotech, they say, how much money have you got? Very different question. Same work, different price tag. Right. And I missed your first question. Quickly, I'll take that one. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll end the question and answer.
Thank you, Mr. Brooksby. I would, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your questions. Can we invite Professor Desai to give Mr. Brooksby a small token of appreciation?
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Oh, that's great.
All right.
We'll share it. Partnership in
Next one, please. All right, one more. So on two now. Thank you.
And thank you for coming. You may be.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for attending this talk. We would appreciate it if you can fill out the feedback form and pass it to any one of our staffs on the way out. Thank you so much.